In the waning days of the Fourth Age, when peace had long settled upon the lands of Gondor, and the memory of the War of the Ring had become but tales told by firelight, there came to the citadel of Minas Tirith troubling reports from the borderland. King Elisar, though aged in wisdom and years, bore still the keen sight of his Dunedain heritage, and it was with great concern that he received word from the rangers who watched the eastern marches. "My lord," spoke Targon, a weathered ranger whose cloak bore the stains of long journeys through treacherous lands, "the dead marshes stir with unnatural lights, not the pale fires of old that have flickered there since time immemorial, but lanterns bright and purposeful, moving as though carried by the living." The king leaned forward upon his throne, the white tree carved in stone behind him, seeming to cast longer shadows in the flickering torchlight. "Tell me all that you have witnessed, Targon of the Ithilien Guard. For 3 nights running, we have observed lights moving in formation across the marsh. They burn, not with the cold gleam of will-o'-wisps, but with the warm glow of oil flame. Someone, or something, tends fires in that accursed place, where none should walk. The local folk of Cair Andros speak of strange chanting carried on the night wind, and their livestock grows restless when darkness falls." Beside the throne stood Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, his face grave with concern. Though years had passed since his father's madness and the siege of the city, the shadow of ancient fears still touched his heart when evil stirred in the borderlands of his domain. "If there be truth in these reports," Faramir said, "then we must act swiftly. The dead marshes have been silent since the Dark Lord's fall. Should some new evil take root there, it might spread like poison through the waters that feed into Anduin." Brr! King Elisar rose from his throne, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of Anduril, though the blade remained sheathed. "Send word to Legolas in the woodland realm, and to Gimli in the glittering cave. If strange lights burn in the dead marshes, then the wisdom of the Eldar and the stout hearts of the Khazad may be needed. Meanwhile, gather to you a company of your most trusted ranger, Faramir. We shall venture forth to see what manner of trespass disturbs the sleep of the ancient dead." Thus it was that within a sennight, a company was assembled in the courtyard of Minas Tirith. Alongside the king and Prince Faramir rode 6 rangers of Ithilien, each skilled in woodcraft and stealth. From the north came Legolas Greenleaf, his keen eyes undimmed by the passage of years, bearing his great bow and the memories of 1,000 hunts. With him rode 3 of his kin from the woodland realm, elves whose names were honored in the halls of Thranduil. Last to arrive, to the surprise of many, was Gimli the dwarf, son of Glóin, whose fame in the forging of arms and armor had spread throughout the kingdoms of men. He bore with him a great war axe, newly forged in the fires of Aglaron, and in his eyes burned the fierce light that kindles in dwarves when they scent danger in the deep places of the world. "A fine day for a journey into cursed marshland," Gimli declared with characteristic gruffness, though those who knew him well could detect the note of excitement in his voice. "Though I confess, I had hoped our next adventure would lead to caves filled with crystal and mithril, not swamps reeking of ancient death." Legolas laughed, the sound like silver bells in the morning air. "Peace, my friend. Have you not learned that in Middle-earth, the most unlikely paths often lead to the greatest wonders? Besides, these eyes of mine have seen stranger sights than glowing marshes, and I would look upon this mystery before passing judgment." As the sun reached its zenith, the company departed Minas Tirith, their horses' hooves ringing upon the great paved way that led eastward toward the Emyn Muil. The standard of Gondor flew above them, white tree upon black field, and the hearts of the rangers were lifted by the presence of their king and the legendary companions who rode beside him. Yet, as they traveled, and the white walls of the city faded behind them, each member of the company felt the weight of some unspoken dread settling upon them like a chill mist. For the dead marshes had been a place of sorrow and terror since the ancient days, and now it seemed that new mysteries stirred in their depths. mysteries that might yet bring shadow upon the hard-won peace of the reunited kingdom. 3 days the company rode through the fair lands of Ithilien, where Faramir's care had brought back much of the region's former beauty. The gardens bloomed with Eleanor and Nifredil, and the streams ran clear and cold from the hills. Yet, as they drew closer to the borders of the Emin Muil, the very air seemed to grow heavy with foreboding. On the second night, as they made camp beneath a grove of ancient Malorn trees that had survived the darkness of Sauron's reign, Legolas stood watch upon a hill overlooking their camp. His elven senses, ever keen to the movements of the natural world, detected something amiss in the patterns of bird and beast. "The creatures of field and forest flee westward," he reported when Aragorn joined him at his post. "Even the raven, who fear little, avoid the eastern sky. There is a wrongness in the air that speaks to their wild hearts." The king gazed into the distance, where the jagged peaks of the Emin Muil cut sharp silhouettes against the star-strewn sky. What manner of wrongness? Is it the taint of Mordor returned, or something else entirely? Nay, not the shadow that we knew of old. This is different. It carries no malice, yet it disturbs the natural order. It is as though the very fabric of the world has been twisted, in some small but significant way. Gimli approached them, his pipe glowing red in the darkness. "In the deep roads of Khazad-dûm, before the Balrog's awakening, my kinfolk sometimes spoke of places where the stone itself seemed to remember ancient sorrow. Not evil, mind you, but changed by great events of long ago. Perhaps these marshes carry such memories, and something has awakened them. Perhaps," Aragorn mused, "yet the reports speak of purposeful lights, moving in formation. Memories do not carry lanterns." The next morning brought no ease to their concern. As they broke their fast with lembas bread gifted by Legolas's kinfolk and clear water from a spring sacred to the elves, one of the rangers reported strange dreams that had visited him in the night. "I dreamed of warriors marching," said Beregond, a sturdy man of Lossarnach whose grandfather had served in the guard of the citadel. "Not the dead of the Pelennor fields, whom I saw with mine own eyes, but warriors of an older time. They bore standards I did not recognize, and their armor was wrought in a fashion I have never seen. They marched through mist and shadow toward some great purpose, but I could not see their destination." "I too dreamed of ancient warriors," spoke Damrod, another of the rangers, "but in my vision they were not marching. They stood in ranks upon a vast battlefield, their spears bright with starlight, facing some enemy that remained hidden in darkness beyond my sight." King Elisar exchanged glances with Faramir, for both had learned to heed the dreams of the Dunedain, which sometimes carried echoes of the past or shadows of things to come. "We shall proceed with all caution," the king declared. "If the dead marshes truly stir with purpose, then we must discover what force moves them, and whether it be friend or foe to the free peoples of Middle-earth." The final approach to the Emin Muil took them through increasingly desolate country. The green fields of Ithilien gave way to barren stone and sparse vegetation, and the very light of the sun seemed dimmed by veils of mist that clung to the rocky hills. By evening of the fourth day, they had reached the borders of the ancient marshland, and there they made their camp upon a ridge that overlooked the vast expanse of treacherous water and shifting ground. As darkness fell, they saw them, the lights that had so troubled the rangers' reports. Not one or two pale flames, but dozens of bright lanterns, moving in orderly procession across the face of the marsh. From their vantage point high above, the company could see that the lights followed ancient pathways that were invisible by day, threading between the pools and mires with purpose and intelligence. "By the valor," whispered Legolas, his keen elven sight piercing the gloom far better than mortal eyes. "Those who bear the lights are armed and armored. I can see the glint of metal and the flutter of banners, though the mist obscures their form." Gimli hefted his axe with a grunt of satisfaction. "Then we shall have answers soon enough, one way or another, though I confess, I liked it better when our enemies had the courtesy to attack us in daylight, upon solid ground." But Aragorn stood silent and thoughtful. his weathered face grave with concern. For in his long years as a ranger, he had learned to trust the wisdom of experience, and something in the measured movement of those distant lights spoke to memories buried deep in the lore of his people. These were not random wanderers in the marsh, nor grave robbers seeking ancient treasure. These lights moved with the discipline of soldiers following orders, with purpose both ancient and immediate. And that, perhaps, was the most troubling thought of all. Dawn brought no relief from the mystery, for with the first light of the sun, the lanterns vanished as though they had never been. Where dozens of bright flames had moved with purpose through the night, now there remained only the still pools and treacherous mires that had given the dead marshes their fearsome name. It is as though the very marsh conspires to hide the truth from us, Faramir observed as he surveyed the seemingly empty wasteland below. By day, there is naught but water and reeds and the pale faces of the long-dead staring up from beneath the surface. Yet we all witnessed the lights, and my ranger's reports were true. King Elisar stood at the edge of their camp, studying the ancient maps that had been brought from the archives of Minas Tirith. These charts, drawn by the lore masters of Gondor in the early days of the Third Age, showed not only the present contours of the marshland, but also the older path that had existed before the great battle of the Last Alliance had forever changed the character of these lands. "See here," he said, pointing to faded lines upon the parchment. In the days before the Battle of Dagorlad, there were roads through this region, causeways built by Gil-galad's engineers to allow the passage of armies through the wetland. After the battle, when the dead of both sides lay scattered across the field, the waters rose and the roads were lost beneath the surface. Legolas approached and studied the map with the keen interest of one whose people remembered those ancient days. My grandfather spoke of those roads. He said they were built not merely for convenience, but for strategy. The Elven King knew that control of the marshes would be crucial to victory, for they guarded the approaches to the Morannon. Then it may be that these lights follow the paths of the old road, Gimli suggested. But who would know their course, save perhaps the elves or the dead themselves? It was decided that they would descend into the marshes themselves, though all knew the peril of such a course. The dead marshes were treacherous to any who did not know their secret ways, and many a traveler had been lost forever in their shifting pools and deceptive paths. Faramir selected two of his most experienced rangers to serve as guides, men who had ventured into the edges of the marsh in pursuit of outlaws and knew something of its dangers. The rest of the company would follow in single file, each step carefully tested before their full weight was committed to the uncertain ground. The descent from the ridge took them first through a region of broken stone and scrub vegetation, where the bones of ancient warriors could still be glimpsed among the rock. Here and there, a rusted sword hilt, or the remains of a shield bearing the devices of long-fallen kingdoms, served as grim reminders of the great battle that had shaped this desolate land. "'Tis a graveyard vast as a kingdom," Gimli muttered, as he carefully picked his way between the scattered relics. "And yet, it seems to me that these bones are too few for the slaughter that was wrought here. Where lie the fallen of the Last Alliance? Surely their number was beyond counting." Legolas paused beside a shattered helm that bore the Star of Elendil upon its brow. The greater part of the battle was fought further east, upon the field before the Black Gate. But here, too, was combat fierce and bitter, as the rearguard of Sauron's host sought to hold the causeways against Gil-galad's advance. As they continued their descent, the ground beneath their feet grew soft and treacherous. Soon they found themselves walking upon narrow paths of solid earth that wound between pools of dark water, where the pale faces of the dead stared up at them with empty eyes. The air grew thick with mist, and strange sounds echoed across the water. Not the cries of living birds, but whispers and sighs that seemed to rise from the depths of the pools themselves. "Stay close," commanded one of the rangers, a man named Mablung, whose father had served with Faramir in the War of the Ring. "The paths here shift with the season, and what was solid ground yesterday may be quicksand today. Test each step with your staff, and look not into the water. for the faces of the dead can draw the living down to join them. For hours they made their slow and careful way deeper into the heart of the marsh. The mist grew thicker as they progressed, until they could barely see more than a few paces ahead. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the splash of water disturbed by their passage and the soft squelch of their boots in the marshy ground. It was near midday when they found the first sign that they were not alone in that desolate place. Upon a small island of solid ground that rose above the surrounding water, they discovered the remains of a recent camp. The ashes of a fire were still warm, and beside them lay scattered items that spoke of hasty departure. A leather water bottle still half full, a loaf of bread, fresh baked and wrapped in cloth, a small knife with its blade bright and newly sharpened. King Elisar knelt beside the fire and stirred the ashes with a stick. This fire was banked, not abandoned in haste. Whoever made camp here expected to return. But where have they gone? Faramir wondered aloud. There are no other paths visible from this spot, and the water around this island is too deep for wading. It was Legolas who provided the answer, his elven eyes detecting what the others had missed. "There," he said, pointing to what appeared to be empty water some 20 paces distant. "The reflection of the mist shows differently there. I believe there is a submerged path running just beneath the surface." With infinite care, they tested his theory, and indeed found a narrow causeway of fitted stones running beneath the dark water. It was ancient work, expertly crafted to remain stable even when submerged, and it led deeper into the heart of the marsh than any of them had dared to venture. As they prepared to follow this hidden road, each member of the company felt the weight of destiny settling upon them, for they were walking now upon paths that had been trod by the greatest heroes of the elder days, and into mysteries that might yet determine the fate of all Middle-earth. The ancient causeway beneath the dark waters proved to be a marvel of forgotten engineering. Each stone had been cut to fit precisely with its neighbors, and despite centuries of submersion, the road remained solid beneath their feet. Yet walking upon it required constant vigilance, for the water rose nearly to their knees, and a single misstep would plunge them into the deep pools that waited on either side. Legolas led the way, his supernatural balance serving him well upon the treacherous path. Behind him came the rangers, their long experience in difficult terrain showing in every careful step. King Elisar followed close behind, one hand upon Andúral's hilt, while Gimli brought up the rear, muttering darkly about the wisdom of following roads that lay beneath water. "'Tis an unnatural thing," the dwarf grumbled, "to build roads where fish might swim. In the halls of my fathers, we carved our ways through living stone, where they would endure until the world's end. This road speaks of desperation, not wisdom." "Peace, my friend," Legolas called back softly. "The elves who built this way did so for reasons of war, not comfort. Sometimes the hidden path is the only path that leads to victory." As they progressed, the mist grew ever thicker until they moved through a world of gray shadows where familiar shapes took on strange and threatening form. The faces in the water seemed to follow their movement, and more than once, a member of the company started at what appeared to be a reaching hand, only to discover it was but a trailing weed or a partially submerged branch. It was near the middle of the afternoon when they encountered the first of the marker. Rising from the water beside the hidden road stood a pillar of black stone, carved with runes that gleamed with their own pale light. The script was Elvish, but of such antiquity that even Legolas required long study to decipher its meaning. "Here fell Orifer's son in valor," he read at last. "Let none who follow forget the price of freedom. This stone marks the grave of an elven prince who died in the Battle of Dagorlad. But strange, the name is worn away, as though deliberately defaced." Faramir examined the stone more closely, running his fingers over the scarred surface where the name had been carved. "This damage is recent," he declared. "See how the edges of the cuts are sharp and clean? Someone has been here within the past few days, with chisel and hammer, to remove this name from memory." "But why would anyone seek to erase the honor of a fallen hero?" wondered Baragon. "What purpose could such desecration serve?" King Elisar studied the defaced stone with troubled eyes. "I know not, but I mislike it greatly. In my experience, those who would hide the names of the dead often do so because they plan mischief among the living." They continued along the submerged road, discovering more markers as they proceeded. Each told a similar tale: stones raised to honor the fallen of the last alliance, with their names carefully and recently removed. The pattern was consistent and deliberate, speaking of purpose rather than random vandalism. The road led them ever deeper into the heart of the marsh, through regions where the mist was so thick that they could barely see their own hands before their faces. Strange sounds echoed through the gray air: distant horns, the clash of weapons, and what might have been voices raised in ancient battle cries, though whether these were memories trapped in the marsh itself or something more immediate, none could say. It was Gimli who first noticed that they were being followed. The dwarf's keen hearing, trained in the echoing halls beneath the earth, detected the subtle splash of water displaced by movement behind them. "We have company," he whispered, hefting his axe. "Someone, or something, follows in our wake, keeping pace but staying beyond sight." The company halted, weapons drawn, straining their senses to pierce the enveloping mist. For long moments they stood motionless, listening to the subtle sounds of the marsh around them. Then, faintly, they heard it, the careful splash of footsteps in water, moving with deliberate stealth along the same submerged road they had been following. "How many?" Aragorn asked quietly. Gimli cocked his head, his trained ears sorting through the sounds of the marsh. "3, perhaps 4. They move with skill, but not skill enough to escape dwarvish hearing. And they keep their distance," Legolas added, his keen eyes probing the mist behind them. "Whatever their purpose, they do not wish a direct confrontation yet." Faramir considered their options. "We could set an ambush, double back and catch them unaware. Or we could continue forward and see where this road leads, learning what we may of their purpose by observing their actions." "Forward," King Elisar decided. "If they wished us harm, they could have struck already in this mist, where we are half blind. Their caution suggests they have some other purpose. Let us see what lies ahead, and perhaps all will be made clear." So they resumed their careful progress along the ancient road, each step taking them deeper into the mysteries of the dead marshes. Behind them, their unseen followers maintained their silent pursuit, while ahead, the submerged causeway led toward some destination that had been hidden in mist and legend for countless years. The afternoon wore on, and still the road continued, winding between pools and islands with the methodical precision of master engineers. Wherever this path led, it had been built to carry armies, and the purpose that drove its construction had been urgent enough to justify tremendous effort and expense. As the day began to wane and shadows deepened in the mist-shrouded marsh, they began to see a new light ahead. Not the pale glow of will-o-wisps or the cold radiance of the faces beneath the water, but the warm, steady light of lanterns. The same lights that had been reported by the rangers, now drawing them forward like beacons in the gathering dusk. And with that light came the sound of voices, speaking in a tongue that was ancient but not unknown, calling to one another across the water with words that carried the weight of command and purpose. At last, it seemed, they would have their answers. As they drew closer to the source of the lights, the ancient causeway began to rise gradually from beneath the water, until at last they found themselves walking upon dry stone. Ahead, through the thinning mist, they could see the glow of many lanterns arranged in orderly rows, and the shapes of figures moving purposefully among them. King Elisar raised his hand, bringing the company to a halt behind the concealment of a cluster of tall reeds. From this vantage point, they could observe without being seen, and what they witnessed filled them with wonder and not a little unease. Before them lay a great island that rose above the surrounding marshes, its surface covered with the ruins of what had once been a mighty fortress. Ancient walls, broken but still imposing, enclosed courtyards where hundreds of figures moved with military precision. These were not the living, nor yet were they the mindless dead. They moved with purpose and intelligence, but their forms flickered and shifted in the lantern light like beings caught between the world of the living and the realm of shadow. "By the valor," breathed Legolas, his keen elven sight piercing the gloom better than mortal eyes. "They are the Oath Breakers, the dead men of Dunharrow. But how come they to be here, in the dead marshes, when their doom was lifted and their souls released to peace?" Gimli gripped his axe more tightly, for the sight of the restless dead stirred ancient fears in the heart of every dwarf. "These are not the same spirits that aided us at Pelargir. Look how they bear themselves with pride and purpose, not the shame that marked the cursed men of the mountain." Indeed, as they watched, it became clear that these spectral warriors bore themselves with the dignity of soldiers in service to a righteous cause. They wore armor of ancient design, bearing the heraldry of kingdoms that had fallen long before the rise of Gondor. Their banners flew proud in the wind that stirred across the marsh, and their movements spoke of discipline and unity of purpose. At the center of the ruined fortress, upon a platform that had once been the foundation of a great tower, stood a figure that commanded the attention of all the ghostly host. Tall and proud, clad in armor that gleamed silver in the lantern light, this spirit bore upon his helm a crown of mithril, and in his hand a sword that blazed with its own inner fire. "Gil-galad," whispered Legolas, and his voice carried such reverence that even the mortals among the company felt the weight of that mighty name. Gil-galad, the Elven King, who fell before the Black Gate in the last stroke of victory, but he passed to the halls of Mandos. How comes he to linger still in the circles of the world? Faramir studied the scene with the keen eye of a military commander. See how they arrange themselves in companies and battalions as though preparing for war, and mark the way they tend their weapons and armor. This is no random gathering of the restless dead, but an army marshaled for battle. But battle against whom? Wondered Beregond. The Dark Lord is cast down, his armies scattered to the wind. What enemy could require the return of the greatest warrior king of the elder days? Their questions were answered in part when a new figure approached the platform where Gil-galad stood. This newcomer moved with the authority of a herald, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the water to where the company lay concealed. "My lord," the herald said, his words ringing with the music of the Elvish tongue, "the beacons of warning have been lit in lands far distant. The watchers in the west report ships upon the sea, bearing black sails and the emblems of the enemy's servants who fled beyond the circles of the world. They return now in the hour of their master's greatest need, seeking to reclaim what was lost." Gil-galad raised his blazing sword, and its light reflected from the waters of the marsh like captured starfire. "Then the time of testing has come again, as the wise foretold. Gather the companies of the faithful dead, all who fell in the service of the light, and who yet remain bound to Middle-earth by ties of love and duty. Let the horns of Gil-galad sound across the marshes, that all who sleep beneath the water may hear and answer." At his command, great horns were lifted, instruments of silver and gold that had been born in the hosts of the Elven kings. Their music rang out across the dead marshes, a sound of such beauty and power that it seemed to stir the very foundations of the world. And in answer to that call, lights began to appear in the dark water. Not the pale fires of the dead, the warm glow of lanterns carried by countless spirits rising from their long sleep. From every pool and mere, from beneath the twisted roots of ancient trees, and from the depths of reed-choked channels, they came, warriors of the last alliance, both elf and man, who had fallen in the great battle and whose bodies had been claimed by the marsh, but also others, soldiers from earlier wars, heroes of the elder days, whose deeds had been forgotten by the living, and even some whose armor bore the tree of Gondor and the horse of Rohan, valiant dead from more recent conflicts who had been granted leave to answer Gil-galad's call. King Elisar watched this mighty gathering with awe and growing understanding. "They prepare for war," he said softly, "but not a war against the living. There is some threat approaching that only the dead can face, some enemy that cannot be touched by mortal weapon. But what manner of foe requires such a host? Gimli asked. And why have we heard no word of this threat in the halls of the living? Before any could answer, they heard movement behind them. Their mysterious followers had finally chosen to reveal themselves. Turning, they saw 3 figures emerging from the mist, and with shock they recognized them as rangers of the north, though their garb was strange and their faces bore marks of great weariness. "Do not reach for your weapons," said the leader of the 3, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. "We are friends, though we serve a purpose that may seem strange to you. I am Halbarad, son of Baldur, and these are my kinsmen, Dunachar and Dervarin. We ride at the bidding of the Valor themselves, bearing word of a danger that threatens all the free peoples of Middle-earth." Aragorn stared in amazement, for he recognized the name, though it should have been impossible. "Halbarad died at Pelargir, fighting at my side against the Corsairs. I saw him fall, pierced by a Southron spear." The ghostly ranger smiled sadly. "Aye, and glad I was to die in such company and such a cause. But death is not always the end of service, my lord. When the need is great enough, even the walls between the world of the living and the realm of the dead may be breached." And with those words, the last pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, though the full scope of the threat they faced remained shrouded in mystery, as deep as the mists that swirled about the dead marshes. The ghostly Halbarad led them to a sheltered hollow among the ruins where they could speak without fear of being overheard by the gathering army of the dead. There, by the light of a lantern that burned with spectral fire, he revealed the nature of the threat that had brought the greatest heroes of the elder days back from their eternal rest. Beyond the circles of the world, he began, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "In the void that lies outside the walls of night, Morgoth, the enemy of the world, stirs in his prison. Though the Valor bound him with chains unbreakable, his hatred finds ways to seep through the barriers that contain him, and in the darkness beyond the farthest seas, his most faithful servant have built a new stronghold." Legolas leaned forward, his immortal face grave with concern. But Morgoth was cast into the timeless void at the end of the First Age. No power in Arda can free him before the end of all things. "True," Halbarad acknowledged, "but his servants need not free him to serve his will. In the years since Sauron's fall, while Middle-earth has known peace, the Black Númenóreans and the Nazgûl, who fled beyond the sunrise, have been gathering strength. They have built ships of shadow and steel, and they sail now toward the shores of Middle-earth, with a host that no mortal army could withstand." Faramir studied the ghostly ranger with the keen attention of a military strategist. "What manner of host? And when do they come?" "They number in the hundreds of thousands," Dervorin answered, his form flickering like flame in a wind. "Not only the surviving servants of the Dark Lord, but new allies won by promise of plunder and dominion. Easterlings from beyond the Sea of Rune, whose kings remember the old hatred. Variags from Khan, thirsting for revenge against Gondor. And worse things still, creatures bred in the darkness beyond the world, abominations that were never meant to walk beneath the light of sun or star. Their vanguard even now crosses the Bay of Forochel," Dunachar added. "They will make landfall within the moon's turning, and their first target will be the Grey Haven, seeking to prevent any from fleeing across the sea to the undying lands." King Elisar felt a chill run through his heart that had nothing to do with the mist-laden air of the marshes. "If this be true, then we must send word immediately to all the free peoples. The beacons must be lit, the armies mustered." "And what armies?" Halbarad interrupted gently. "The great host that fought at the Pelennor fields is scattered to the wind. Most of the heroes of the War of the Ring have passed into the west, or lie at peace in honored grave. The Ents sleep in Fangorn, the eagles roost in their distant eyries, and the elves grow ever fewer. Even the combined might of Gondor and Rohan could not stand against the force that approaches." "Then what hope remains?" Gimli demanded, though his grip on his axe never wavered. "If mortal strength cannot prevail, then we must look to the Valor for aid. And so we have. the ghostly ranger replied. But the Valor will not again send the host of the West to intervene directly in the affairs of Middle-earth. Instead, they have granted a different mercy, the return of those who died in service to the light, that they might stand one last time against the returning darkness. Legolas gazed toward the ruined fortress, where Gil-galad marshaled his ghostly army. The dead fight for the living, as they did at Pelargir, but this time, the battle will be far greater. Indeed, and this time, the dead alone cannot achieve victory. They can hold the enemy at bay, perhaps, and buy time for the living to prepare their defenses. But ultimate victory must come through other means that we have yet to discover. A new voice spoke from the darkness beyond their circle of lantern light, a voice that carried the authority of command and the weight of long experience in war. Perhaps, it said, the answer lies not in strength of arms, but in the wisdom of the ancient days. They turned to see Gil-galad himself approaching, his spectral form radiant with the inner light that had marked him as the greatest of the Elven Kings. Though he bore the appearance of the mighty lord who had stood beside Elendil before the Black Gate, there was something in his eyes that spoke of knowledge gained in the halls of the dead. "My lord, Gil-galad," Legolas said, rising and bowing deeply. "We are honored beyond measure by your presence." The Elven King smiled, and for a moment, the shadow of death seemed to lift from him entirely. "Peace, Greenleaf of the woodland realm. In this hour, we are all servants of the same cause. I have come because there are things you must know, things that may yet turn the tide of the coming war." He gestured toward the broken walls of the ancient fortress. This place was built in the early days of the Third Age, as a fortress of the Last Alliance, a garrison to guard the approaches to Mordor after Sauron's first defeat. But it was more than a military stronghold. It was a repository of knowledge, a place where the lore masters of both elves and men gathered to study the deeper mysteries of the enemy's power. "What manner of mysteries?" King Elisar asked. "The power that binds evil to the circles of the world," Gil-galad replied. "For you see, when Morgoth was cast into the void, he did not simply vanish from existence. His malice remains, like poison in a wound, infecting the very substance of creation. Sauron was but one manifestation of that poison, and his defeat merely drove it deeper underground." The Elven King's expression grew grave as he continued, "The approaching enemy draws its strength from that same sword. They have found ways to channel Morgoth's hatred across the barriers that contain him, and each victory they achieve strengthens the connection. If they succeed in reconquering Middle-earth, the prison walls may weaken enough to allow their master's direct influence to return. Then we face not merely an invasion," Faramir said slowly, "but the possible return of the greatest evil that ever threatened creation." Indeed, but the ancient lore masters were not idle in their studies. Deep in the vaults beneath this fortress, they discovered something that may yet provide hope, a weapon not of steel or fire, but of understanding itself. And with those words, Gil-galad began to lead them toward the heart of the ruined fortress, where secrets had waited in darkness for more than 1,000 years, secrets that might yet determine the fate of all the world. The path to the ancient vault led through chambers that had once housed the greatest scholars of the Third Age. Broken shelves lined the walls, their contents long since claimed by time and weather, while underfoot lay scattered fragments of scrolls and tablets whose wisdom had been lost to the world above. Gil-galad moved through these ruins with the confidence of one who had walked these halls when they still rang with learned voices, his spectral form casting dancing shadows that seemed to bring the dead stones to life. "Here," he said, pausing before what appeared to be a blank wall of fitted stone, "the lore masters concealed their most precious discoveries. They feared that such knowledge, if it fell into the wrong hand, might serve the enemy's cause, rather than opposing it." The Elven King placed his translucent hand upon a carved symbol that was barely visible in the ancient mason. At his touch, the stone began to glow with the same silver light that emanated from his sword, and slowly, silently, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow stairway descending into darkness. "The stairs are warded against the living," Gil-galad explained as he beckoned them forward. "But in my presence you may pass safely. Mind your steps, for the way is steep, and there are no railings to prevent a fall." Down they went, following the spiral stair ever deeper into the foundations of the fortress. The air grew thick and still, heavy with the weight of ages and the accumulated dust of centuries. Strange symbols carved into the walls began to glow as Gil-galad passed, creating pools of silver radiance that revealed glimpses of murals depicting scenes from the great wars of the elder day. Gimli, ever alert to the craftsmanship of worked stone, examined the walls with professional interest. "'Tis dwarf work," he declared with satisfaction. The mason who carved these passages was taught in the halls of Khazad-dûm, or I am no son of Glóin. But what brought dwarf crafters to build in such a place? "The alliance was indeed an alliance," Gil-galad replied. "When the free peoples stood together against the darkness, the children of Aule lent their skill to our common cause. The secrets we sought to hide were deemed worthy of the finest defenses that could be wrought." Dirty, at the bottom of the stair, they found themselves before a great door of black adamant, its surface covered with interwoven runes in the scripts of all the free people, Elvish and Dwarvish, the tongues of men, and even, to Gimli's surprise, symbols that belonged to the Ents of Fangorn. The door stood slightly ajar, and from beyond it came a faint glow of warm, golden light. "Someone has been here before us," Faramir observed, noting the recent disturbance in the dust around the threshold. "Indeed," Gil-galad confirmed. "One yet lives who possesses the authority to enter this place, though I confess myself surprised that he chose to reveal its secrets at this time." They passed through the doorway into a vast circular chamber, whose walls rose beyond the reach of mortal sight. The space was filled with shelves and cases containing books, scroll, tablet, and artifacts whose purposes were not immediately apparent. At the center of the room stood a great desk of carved white stone, and behind it sat a figure that made even King Elisar catch his breath in wonder. The man appeared to be in the full vigor of middle age, though his hair was silver white and his beard flowed down over a robe of deep blue, marked with silver stars. His eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom accumulated over long centuries, and when he looked up from the ancient tome he was studying, those eyes held no surprise at seeing the visitors who had descended to his sanctum. "Welcome," said Gandalf the White, for it was indeed the wizard who sat among the hoarded lore of ages. "I have been expecting you, though I confess the timing is somewhat earlier than I had hoped." Legolas stared in amazement. "Mithrandir, but you sailed from the Grey Havens with the Ring-Bearers. How come you to be here, in the depths of the dead marshes?" The wizard smiled, and for a moment the weight of care seemed to lift from his shoulders. "I sailed indeed, and dwelt for a time in the peace of the undying lands. But like Gil-galad here, I have been granted leave to return in this hour of greatest need, for the threat that approaches cannot be faced with sword and shield alone. It requires understanding of powers that reach back to the very foundations of creation." He gestured to the tome before him, its pages yellowed with age, but still clearly legible. The lore masters of the Alliance discovered something that even I, in all my years of study, had not suspected. The power of Morgoth was not simply exiled from the world, it was woven into the very fabric of creation, like a flaw in a great tapestry that weakens the whole cloth. King Elisar approached the desk, his expression grave with growing understanding. "You speak of the source of the shadow that has plagued Middle-earth since the beginning of day. I speak of something far more fundamental," Gandalf replied. "The music of creation itself was marred by Melkor's discord, and that dissonance echoes still through all the works of the world. Every evil that has risen since, Sauron, the Balrogs, the dragon, all the servants of darkness, has drawn its strength from that primordial flaw." Gimli hefted his axe, though his gesture seemed uncertain in the face of such cosmic implication. "Then, how can any power of the created world stand against such a force, if the very foundations are corrupted?" "Ah," Gandalf said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been hope. But the lore masters discovered something else as well. The discord that mars creation also makes it possible to achieve something that the enemy, in his perfection of evil, cannot imagine. He turned several pages in the ancient book, revealing diagrams and formulae whose meaning was obscure to all, save, perhaps, Gil-galad and Legolas. The flaws in the music can be turned against themselves, creating harmonies of such beauty and power that they heal the very dissonance from which they spring. It requires perfect cooperation between all the peoples of the world, elves, men, dwarves, and all others who serve the light. But if such cooperation can be achieved, the prison that holds Morgoth be strengthened beyond any possibility of breach. Gil-galad finished, and his servants in Middle-earth would find their power broken at source. Precisely, but the window of opportunity is narrow. The approaching enemy knows of this possibility. It is why they strike now, seeking to prevent such cooperation by conquering or corrupting all who might stand together. We have perhaps a moon's turning to gather the scattered peoples and achieve the unity that has eluded Middle-earth since the breaking of the Fellowship of the Last Alliance. Faramir studied the ancient diagrams with the eye of a strategist. What would such unity require? More than treaties and alliances, I think. Much more, Gandalf confirmed. It would require representatives of each people to willingly sacrifice something precious to them. Not their lives, which many have already given freely, but something deeper. Their individual natures must be offered up and woven together into a new harmony, one that has never existed before in the history of the world. And as the full implications of his words began to sink in, each member of the company began to understand the true magnitude of the choice that lay before them, and the price that victory might demand. The revelation of what would be required for victory cast a heavy silence over the company. Each member grappled with the implications of Gandalf's words, while around them, the accumulated wisdom of ages seemed to press down like a physical weight. It was Legolas who spoke first, his immortal perspective lending clarity to the moral complexities they faced. To sacrifice one's essential nature. For an elf, this would mean surrendering the timeless connection to the music of creation that defines our very existence. We would become as mortal, bound to the circles of the world until its ending. And for men, Aragorn said slowly, it would mean abandoning the gift of mortality itself, the freedom to pass beyond the world when our time is done, which Ilúvatar granted to the second-born alone. Gimli's laugh was harsh and bitter. For the dwarves, it would be worse still. We would have to give up our connection to the stone and the deep places, the craft skill that Aula set in our hands. We would become as children, helpless before the works of smithy and mine. Gandalf nodded gravely. You begin to understand, but consider also what would be gained. The representatives who made such sacrifices would become something new, beings who partook of all the people's gifts, while being limited by none. They would be the first of a new kindred, one that could wield powers beyond any that have been seen since the Elder Days. But they would no longer be themselves, Faramir observed. The elf who made such a sacrifice would no longer be truly of the Eldar, nor the man truly one of the Edain. They would be something else entirely, and therein lies both the hope and the terrible burden of this path, Gil-galad added. For the harmony that could heal creation's flaws can only be achieved by those willing to transcend the divisions that have defined the peoples since the beginning of time. Halbarad's ghostly form shimmered as he leaned forward. How many representatives would be needed? And must they all be of high rank and noble birth? The lore suggests that 7 would suffice, 1 each for elves, men, dwarves, hobbits, ents, eagles, and 1 to represent all the other children of Ilúvatar who dwell in Middle-earth. As for rank, Gandalf shrugged. The music cares nothing for titles or bloodline. What matters is the willingness to sacrifice, the strength of heart to bear the transformation. King Elisar paced to the edge of the chamber, his weathered face drawn with the weight of kingship and the burden of choice. If I were to make such a sacrifice, What would become of Gondor? How could I rule a people whose nature I no longer shared? Perhaps, Gil-galad suggested gently, that is the wrong question to ask. Perhaps the question should be, what will become of Gondor if you do not make this choice? The enemy's host grows stronger with each passing hour, Dervarin confirmed. Our scouts in the realm of the dead report that they have made alliance with powers from the uttermost east and south, kingdoms that were thought to be mere legend. When they strike, they will do so with such force that no earthly kingdom can stand against them. Gimli was examining one of the ancient artifacts on the chamber's shelves, a hammer whose head was wrought from what appeared to be starlight made solid. These implements, they were crafted for the purpose you describe? Indeed, Gandalf replied. The lore masters of the Alliance prepared for this eventuality, though they hoped it would never come to pass. Each tool is designed to facilitate the transformation of one of the peoples, and each carries within it a fragment of the original music, harmony preserved from before Melkor's discord first marred creation. Legolas approached a bow, whose string gleamed like captured moonbeams. The sacrifice required. Would it be immediate and irreversible? The transformation, once begun, cannot be undone, the wizard confirmed. But it would not happen all at once. The representatives would retain their original natures long enough to return to their people and gather them for the final working. Only when all seven stood together in the appointed place would the true sacrifice commence. And where is this appointed place? Faramir asked. Gil-galad's expression grew solemn. The highest peak of the lonely mountain, where the light of the stars falls most purely upon Middle-earth. It was there that the first alliance between dwarves and men was forged, and it is there that the final alliance must be consecrated. Erebor, Gimli murmured. Aye, there is power in that place, though it sleeps deep beneath the mountain's roots. But to reach it, we would have to cross half of Middle-earth, while the enemy's forces seek to prevent us. Not all of us, Aragorn said, decision crystallizing in his voice. If 7 representatives are needed, then 7 must be chosen and sent forth while the rest organize what defense they may. The armies of the dead can buy us time, but they cannot achieve victory alone. Then the choice is before us, Gandalf declared. Who among the living will risk everything for the chance to heal creation itself? Who will surrender their very nature to become something new and strange for the sake of all who live and breathe under sun and star? One by one, they began to step forward, understanding at last the true meaning of the lights they had seen moving through the dead marshes. Those lanterns had not been carried by invaders or grave robbers, but by the last guardians of hope itself, preparing for a choice that would echo through all the ages of the world. The time for half measures and partial sacrifices had passed. Now, in the depths of an ancient vault beneath the dead marshes, the fate of all Middle-earth would be decided by the willing hearts of those who loved it enough to give up everything they were for the chance to save everything they loved. Word spread swiftly through the hidden channels that connected the free peoples of Middle-earth. The Palantir of Minas Tirith carried urgent messages to the far corners of the reunited kingdom, while swift riders bore sealed commands to the lords of Rohan. In the depths of Fangorn Forest, the Ents stirred from their long contemplation, and in the distant halls of Erebor, the sound of hammers on anvils rang day and night as the dwarves prepared for war. But it was a strange kind of preparation, for this would be unlike any war ever fought in Middle-earth. The armies that mustered did so not primarily to battle the enemy's hosts, though battle there would surely be, but to protect 7 individuals whose sacrifice might save creation itself. In the ruins of the ancient fortress, now fully revealed in the gathering twilight, the representatives prepared for their journey to Erebor. The 7 had been chosen by lot and by the weight of their people's need. Legolas for the elves, carrying the moonbeam bow. Gimli for the dwarf, bearing the starlight hammer. Aragorn for men, with a crown wrought from silver and mithril. Faramir for the Númenórean, whose bloodline carried ancient wisdom, and 3 others who had answered the call when it went forth. From the Shire had come Meriadoc Brandybuck, now Master of Buckland, his hair silver with age, but his courage undimmed by the passage of years. For the hobbits, none save the heroes of the War of the Ring possessed the necessary strength of will to endure the transformation that awaited. From the distant reaches of Rohan rode Eowyn, Lady of Ithilien, her shield arm still strong despite the years that had passed since she faced the Witch King on the Pelennor fields. She came not as herself alone, but as the representative of all the horse lords and the wild hearts who served no master save honor. Most surprising of all was the 7th representative, Radagast the Brown, who emerged from the woods of Rosgobel, bearing tokens of alliance from beasts and birds, from the Ents of Fangorn and the eagles of the Misty Mountain. His staff was wound with vines and crowned with living flowers, and about his shoulders perched ravens and falcons who served as his messengers to the wild kindred. 7 paths converging upon a single destiny, Gandalf observed, as the representatives gathered in the fortress courtyard, while Gil-galad's ghostly army made ready for its own grim march. Yet the enemy will not stand idle while we attempt our working. Even now his vanguard makes landing upon the western shores. Reports had been arriving throughout the day, brought by the spirits of the dead, who could traverse vast distances in the blink of an eye. The enemy's fleet had made landfall at 3 points along the coast, a great host at the Grey Haven, seeking to capture or destroy the ships that might carry refugees to safety, a smaller but more dangerous force at the mouth of the Mithithil, moving to cut off communications between the eastern and western realms, and strangest of all, a fleet of black ships that had appeared in the Bay of Forochel, bearing creatures that should not have been able to endure the bitter cold of those northern waters. They seek to divide our forces and prevent any coordinated resistance, Faramir analyzed, studying the reports with the eye of a veteran strategist. But more than that, they aim to reach Erebor before we do. If they can corrupt or destroy the site of our working, then all hope dies, Radagast finished grimly. The harmony we seek to create requires a place where the music still sounds purely, unmarred by discord. There are few such places left in Middle-earth, and Erebor is the greatest of them. Gil-galad approached, his spectral form bearing tidings from his own scouts among the dead. The enemy's strategy is more cunning than we first supposed. They do not merely seek to reach Erebor first, they seek to corrupt the very representatives we have chosen. Each of you will face temptations designed specifically to exploit your deepest fears and desires. What manner of temptations? Merry asked, though his voice held no fear, only the practical concern of a hobbit preparing for a difficult journey. For each, they will be different, the Elven King replied. They will offer you versions of your deepest dreams, immortality for those who fear death, mortality for those who yearn for rest, power for those who feel helpless, peace for those who have known only struggle. And in each case, the offer will be real. They have the power to grant these things. Eowyn laughed, and there was iron in the sound. Let them come. I have faced worse temptations than power and peace. In the darkest hour of the war, when death seemed certain and defeat inevitable, we held to our purpose. We shall not falter now. Nevertheless, Aragorn said, we must prepare for such attacks upon our resolve. The physical journey to Erebor will be perilous enough without also battling corruption of the spirit. It was decided that the 7 would travel by separate routes, each guarded by a company of the finest warriors that could be spared. If one group was captured or corrupted, the others might still reach their destination. Meanwhile, the armies of the living would engage the enemy's hosts in open battle, seeking to draw their attention away from the true purpose of the mission. As the last preparations were completed and the companies made ready to depart, Gandalf drew the 7 representatives aside for a final council. Remember, he said, his voice carrying all the authority of his ancient wisdom, the sacrifice you will make is not merely personal. When you surrender your individual nature, you will become living symbols of unity among all the free people. The power that will flow through you will be drawn from every heart that beats for freedom, every will that chooses light over darkness. And if we fail, Legolas asked quietly, then the discord that mars creation will spread until it breaks the very foundations of the world. The wizard replied without hesitation, the void will claim all that is, and the music of creation will fall silent forever. With those grim words echoing in their hearts, the 7 companies departed the ancient fortress, each taking a different path through the treacherous marshland toward the distant peak of Erebor. Behind them, Gil-galad's army of the dead began its own march toward the coast, where the enemy's forces had landed. The greatest gamble in the history of Middle-earth had begun, and upon its outcome hung the fate of all creation. 3 days out from the dead marshes, the 7 companies had spread across Middle-earth like the fingers of an outstretched hand. Each group faced its own perils as they made their way toward Erebor, and each of the chosen representatives began to understand the true weight of the burden they had accepted. Legolas and his escort of woodland elves had taken the northernmost route, following hidden paths through Mirkwood that few mortals had ever seen. Yet even in these familiar woods, danger stalked them. The trees themselves seemed to whisper seductive offers of peace and endless rest, while shapes moved in the shadows. Elves who had supposedly sailed west long ago now returned with tales of the bliss that awaited beyond the sunset. "Come with us, Prince of the Woodland Realm," called one of these apparitions, her voice sweet as silver bell. "Why struggle against the inevitable? When creation fails, the elves at least will be safe beyond the reach of darkness. You need not sacrifice your immortal nature. Instead, embrace it fully and dwell forever in the light of the 2 trees." But Legolas's bow sang in answer, and the arrow he loosed passed through the false elf's heart, revealing her true nature as a wraith sent to corrupt his purpose. "My immortality means nothing if I use it only to flee from duty," he declared to his companions. "Forward, while the path remains clear." Meanwhile, Gimli led his company of Ironhill's dwarves through the tunnels beneath the misty mountains, seeking to avoid the enemy's forces that now marched across the surface lands. But in the deep places, other temptations awaited. Veins of mithril gleamed in the stone walls, more precious than any treasure the dwarves had ever beheld, while whispered voices spoke of caverns filled with gems beyond counting. "Take what you will," urged a voice that seemed to come from the stone itself. "Why serve others when you could rule as kings beneath the earth? The surface world will burn whether you reach Erebor or not, but you could preserve your people by claiming the deeps as your eternal realm." Gimli's starlight hammer blazed in response, and its light revealed the truth. The mithril was fool's silver, the gems mere glass, and the voice belonged to a Balrog's shadow, a fragment of the evil that had once claimed Khazad-dûm. "My people's honor is worth more than all the treasures of the earth," the dwarf declared, and led his company onward through passages where the stone itself had been cleansed by the hammer's light. Aragorn and his rangers took the most direct route across the plains of Rohan, reasoning that speed was more important than stealth. But as they rode, the very landscape seemed to shift around them. Paths that should have led north curved mysteriously eastward, toward the borders of Mordor, while mirages showed Minas Tirith in flames and Gondor's people crying out for their king's return. "Your duty is to your kingdom, not to some mad scheme of sacrifice," whispered a voice that spoke with the authority of kingship itself. "Return to Minas Tirith, defend what you have built, and let others attempt this fool's errand. A king's first responsibility is to his people." But Aragorn's crown blazed with silver fire, and his will remained unshaken. "A king's first responsibility is to the future his people will inherit," he replied. "If Middle-earth falls to darkness, what good will a crown be to anyone?" Each of the companies faced similar trials as they made their way toward Erebor. Faramir's group was beset by visions of his father Denethor, who urged him to abandon hope and seek only to make a glorious ending. Merry found himself confronted by phantoms of the Shire, showing him his homeland in ruins while his voice called to him to return and defend it. rather than chase dreams of cosmic unity. Eowyn's path led through lands where the dead of the Pelennor fields rose again, not as allies but as accusers, demanding to know why she rode to risk everything when their sacrifice had already bought peace for Middle-earth. And Radagast wandered through forests where every tree and flower begged him to remain and tend them rather than venture forth on a quest that might see all growing things perish. Yet despite these trials, all 7 companies continued their advance, for the representatives had been chosen well. Each possessed the strength of will to resist even the most cunning temptation, and each understood that the alternative to their sacrifice was the destruction of everything they held dear. It was on the 5th day of their journey that they received word of the first great battle of the war. Gil-galad's army of the dead had met the enemy's vanguard at the Grey Havens, and the clash had been terrible to behold. Mortal weapons could not touch the ghostly warriors, but the enemy had brought with them creatures of shadow and flame that could battle the dead on equal terms. The battle raged for 3 days and nights, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. The enemy's forces were driven back from the Grey Havens themselves, terrible cost. Many of Gil-galad's most valiant warriors had been destroyed utterly, their spirits scattered to the winds from which no power could recall them. Worse news came from the other fronts. The force that had landed at the Mithaithel had broken through the defenses of Tharbad and was now marching toward the borders of Rohan, while the mysterious army from the Bay of Forochil had vanished entirely, its destination unknown. They seek to force us into open battle before we can complete our working. Gandalf's voice spoke to each of the representatives through the Palantir stones they carried. Do not be drawn aside by reports of defeat or victory. Your purpose remains unchanged. Reach Erebor at all costs, and trust that others will hold the line until your sacrifice can be completed. But even as the wizard spoke these words, new reports were arriving at the citadel of Minas Tirith, reports that would change the entire character of their desperate race against time. For the enemy's true strategy was at last revealed, and it was more cunning and terrible than any of them had imagined. The mysterious army from the Bay of Forochel had not vanished. It had entered the ancient tunnels beneath the misty mountains, the same passages that connected to the deep roads of Khazad-dûm. They were not marching to intercept the 7 companies at all. They were marching directly toward Erebor itself, through paths that would bring them to the lonely mountain days before any of the representatives could arrive. The news of the enemy's flanking maneuver through the deeps sent shockwaves through the forces of the Free Peoples. In the span of a few hours, what had seemed a difficult but manageable race to Erebor became a desperate struggle against almost impossible odds. In the halls of Minas Tirith, emergency councils convened as messenger birds brought word from across Middle-earth. The armies of Gondor and Rohan, already stretched thin by the need to guard multiple fronts, could not possibly redeploy fast enough to intercept the underground army before it reached the lonely mountain. But hope came from an unexpected quarter, in the deep halls of Khazad-dûm, where the Balrog's shadow had long held dominion. Gimli's passage with the Starlight Hammer had awakened something that had slept since the fall of the Dwarf Kingdom. The ancient guardians of the deep places, stone giants and fire spirits bound to the service of Olay himself, stirred from their long slumber and heard the call to battle. The deep roads remember their makers, came the message from Balin's tomb, where the Company of the Ring had once paid their respects to the fallen lord. The children of the stone called to their children. We who died in the deeps will rise once more to guard the paths our forefathers carved. Similar stirrings were reported from other ancient places. In the depths of the Iron Hills, where dwarves had delved for centuries, the very mountains began to move as the bones of the earth itself awakened to defend the passages that led toward Erebor. And from the Grey Mountains came word that dragons, not the evil worms that had served the enemy, but the ancient fire spirits from which the lesser dragons had been corrupted, emerged from their hidden lairs to contest the sky roads above the peaks. Yet even with such aid, the race remained desperate. The enemy's underground army moved with supernatural speed, driven by powers that needed no rest and feared no obstacle. They swept through the abandoned halls of Khazad-dûm like a black tide, overwhelming the hastily assembled defenders and pressing ever northward toward their goal. Meanwhile, the 7 companies of the representatives faced their own escalating peril. No longer content with spiritual temptation, the enemy now sent physical forces to intercept them. Nazgul rode forth from hidden lairs, their black breath chilling the hearts of even the bravest warriors, while winged creatures dark as storm clouds dove from the sky to strike at the companies from above. It was Eowyn's group that first encountered the full fury of the enemy's pursuit. As they rode across the plains of Rohan, seeking to reach the passes through the misty mountains, they found themselves confronted by a host of Easterlings who had somehow crossed the great river without detection. "Yield up the Lady of Ithilien," called the enemy commander, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for powers beyond the circles of the world. "She who was promised to darkness at Pelennor may yet serve a greater purpose. Give her to us, and the rest may depart unharmed." But Eowyn's sword blazed with silver fire as she drew it, and her voice rang clear across the battlefield. "I am no man's to give, and no darknesses to claim. Come and take me if you can." The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Though the Easterlings were skilled warriors, they had not reckoned with the fury of Rohan's horse lords when their honor was challenged. Eowyn herself cut down the enemy commander, her blade burning with the light of the stars as it claimed his life. Yet victory came at a price. Several of her escort had fallen, and precious time had been lost. When they finally reached the mountain passes, they discovered that the paths were already contested by enemy forces that had somehow anticipated their route. Similar scenes played out across Middle-earth, as each company faced escalating opposition, yet through skill, courage, and no small measure of luck, all 7 groups continued their advance toward Erebor, though each arrival was delayed by hours or days that they could ill afford to lose. It was Legolas who first reached the lonely mountain, his elven sight allowing him to pick out safe paths even in the darkest night. What he found there filled him with both hope and dread. The great halls of Erebor had not been idle since receiving word of the approaching crisis. Every dwarf who could wield hammer or axe had been set to work strengthening the mountain's defenses, while Dane Ironfoot himself had taken command of preparation for the final battle. But the enemy's underground army was closer than anyone had dared fear. The deep drums of Khazad-dûm carried news of the defenders' last stand in the chamber of Mazarbul, where the tomb of Balin had become a rallying point for all who would stand against the darkness. The ancient guardians fought valiantly, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the terrible power of the enemy's dark sorcery. 3 days, Dain reported grimly when Legolas reached the throne hall of Erebor. Perhaps 4, if the defenders of the deep roads can hold longer than expected. But no more than that before the enemy's vanguard reaches the mountain's roots. One by one, the other representatives arrived, each bringing word of escalating crisis from across Middle-earth. The armies of the dead had been forced to give ground at every front, while the forces of the living were stretched beyond their breaking point. Time was running out, and still 2 of the 7 had not yet reached Erebor. It was on the morning of what might prove to be the last day that Radagast finally arrived, his brown robes torn and his staff cracked from the battles he had fought along the way. But his eyes held a light that had not been there when he departed the dead marshes, and when he spoke, his voice carried new authority. "I have walked through fire and shadow to reach this place," he declared, "and I have learned something that changes everything. The enemy's strategy is not merely to prevent our working, it is to corrupt it. They seek to arrive at the moment of our sacrifice and twist the harmony we create into a discord that will shatter the foundations of creation itself." The implications of his words struck the assembled company like a physical blow. If the enemy could corrupt their working at the crucial moment, then their sacrifice would not heal creation's flaws, but worsen them beyond any possibility of repair. "Then we must begin immediately," Aragorn declared, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge that Faramir had not yet arrived. 6 of 7 may suffice if our will is strong enough. But even as he spoke, horns sounded from the walls of Erebor, and the great gates swung open to admit the last of the representatives. Faramir rode through the gates at the head of a company that had clearly seen hard fighting, his banner torn and his armor rent. But he lived, and with him came the final piece needed for their desperate gamble. "Now," Gil-galad's voice spoke from the shadows where his ghostly form awaited, "let us see if the willing sacrifice of 7 can achieve what all the armies of Middle-earth together cannot accomplish." The time for preparation had ended. The final choice lay before them, and upon their decision hung the fate of all creation. At the peak of the lonely mountain, where the light of the stars fell pure and unfiltered upon the ancient stone, the 7 representatives gathered for the working that would either save or damn all creation. The artifacts they bore, bow and hammer, crown and staff, sword and shield and harp, had been arranged in a perfect circle, each glowing with its own inner radiance as the moment of culmination approached. Below them, the deep drums of Khazad-dûm fell silent at last. The defenders of the ancient roads had made their final stand, and now the enemy's vanguard was ascending through the very roots of the mountain. Soon, the forces of darkness would burst forth into the halls of Erebor itself, seeking to corrupt or destroy the working before it could be completed. "Remember," Gandalf said, his voice carrying across the wind that howled around the mountain's peak, "once the transformation begins, it cannot be stopped or reversed. You will cease to be what you are and become something new, beings who embody the unity of all the free peoples." "And if we succeed?" Legolas asked, his hand resting on the moonbeam bow that would soon claim his elven nature as its price. "Then creation itself will be healed," Gil-galad replied. His ghostly form stood at the edge of the circle, unable to participate in the working, but serving as witness to the greatest sacrifice in the history of the world. "The discord that has plagued all things since the beginning will be resolved into harmony, and the prison that holds Morgoth will be strengthened beyond any possibility of breach." One by one, the 7 stepped forward and placed their hands upon the artifacts that would transform them. As they did, light began to build around the circle, not the harsh glare of fire, but the gentle radiance of starlight gathered and focused into a single point of blazing purity. But even as the working began, the enemy's forces burst forth from the depths of the mountain. Black armored warriors poured from every tunnel and stairway, their weapons gleaming with poisoned light as they sought to reach the peak before the transformation could be completed. The defenders of Erebor met them with courage born of desperation. Dane Ironfoot himself led the charge, his axe blazing with the ancient fire of the dwarf lords as he carved a path through the enemy's ranks. Behind him came the best warriors of the Iron Hills, their shields locked and their spears bright with starfire. But it was not mortal weapons alone that held the line. As the 7 representatives began their transformation, power flowed from them into all who fought for the light. Dwarf axes burned like captured sunlight, elven bows sang with the music of the spheres, and the swords of men blazed with the accumulated courage of all who had died for freedom. The transformation itself was both beautiful and terrible to witness. One by one, the representatives began to change, their individual natures dissolving into something greater and more terrible than any single people had ever produced. Legolas's immortal grace merged with Gimli's earthbound steadiness. Aragorn's wisdom of command blended with Faramir's scholarly knowledge. Merry's practical courage united with Éowyn's warrior's fury. And Radagast's connection to the wild things became the foundation upon which all the others built. As the process continued, the very air around the mountain began to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the music of creation first brought the world into being. The discord that had marred that primal song, the source of all evil and corruption, began to resolve itself into new patterns of overwhelming beauty. But the enemy was not without resources of their own. From the depths of the mountain came a new sound, a counter melody of such hideous dissonance that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The corruption that Morgoth had introduced into creation's foundation rose up to contest the harmony being woven by the Seven. It was then that the truth was revealed, the final twist that none had anticipated. For the counter-melody was not being sung by the enemy's forces alone. Among the black-armored warriors who had burst from the depths came figures whose identity struck the defenders with shock, dismay. They were the Rangers of the North, who had been reported missing weeks before, but they had not been captured or slain. They had been corrupted, turned to the enemy's service by promises that preyed upon their deepest fears. And at their head marched a figure that made even Gil-galad's ghostly form recoil in horror. It was Isildur himself, the ancient king who had cut the ring from Sauron's hand, but not the noble hero of legend. This was Isildur, as he might have been if he had never climbed Mount Doom, if he had kept the ring and been slowly consumed by its power over the long centuries since the last alliance. Did you think, this dark mirror of the ancient king called out, as his corrupted forces pressed toward the circle, that the enemy had no plan for this eventuality? Every noble sacrifice can be perverted. Every act of heroism turned to evil's purpose. Your transformation will succeed, but it will create not harmony, but the most perfect discord ever achieved. The revelation sent shockwaves through the defenders, for they understood at last the true scope of the trap that had been laid. The enemy had not sought to prevent the working. They had sought to corrupt it from within, turning the representative's sacrifice into a weapon that would shatter creation itself. But it was Gandalf who provided the answer, his voice rising above the chaos of battle with words that carried all the authority of the Valar themselves. The discord seeks to corrupt the harmony, but harmony, once truly achieved, can purify even the deepest corruption. Do not fear the darkness that opposes you. Embrace it, transform it, make it part of the greater song. With those words, the seven representatives made their final choice. Instead of rejecting the discordant counter-melody that rose from the enemy's forces, they welcomed it into their working, allowing it to become part of the harmony they were creating. The result was not the pure, simple song they had originally planned, but something far more complex and powerful. A symphony that encompassed both light and shadow, hope and despair, creation and destruction, weaving them all into a pattern of beauty beyond mortal comprehension. The transformation was completed in a burst of light that could be seen from the borders of the Shire to the shores of the Sea of Rune. When it faded, the seven representatives had become something new, beings who embodied not just the unity of the free peoples, but the reconciliation of all opposites within creation itself. The corrupted Isildur and his Dark Rangers found their discord transformed into harmony, their hatred purified into love, their despair redeemed into hope. The enemy's forces, caught in the expanding wave of transformation, discovered that their very corruption had become the foundation for a deeper healing than anyone had dared imagine. And in the void beyond the circles of the world, Morgoth felt the prison that contained him strengthened beyond any possibility of escape. For the flaw in creation that had been his only link to the material world had been healed at last, not by rejecting the discord he had introduced, but by weaving it into a greater harmony that made even evil serve the purposes of good. The war was won not through conquest, but through transformation, not through the defeat of darkness, but through its redemption. And in the years that followed, as the new age dawned across Middle-earth, bards would sing of the seven who gave up everything they were to become everything that was needed, and of the harmony that finally healed the ancient wound in creation's heart. The lanterns that had glowed in the dead marshes were extinguished at last, for their purpose had been fulfilled, but the light they had kindled would burn forever in the hearts of all who loved freedom, unity, and the hope that even the deepest darkness could be transformed into light. Thus ended the greatest sacrifice in the history of Middle-earth, and thus began the age when all the peoples of the world would learn to sing in harmony, their individual voices joining in a song more beautiful than any one of them could achieve alone.